a little boy, just 12 years old, walking behind his mother's coffin. His face is blank, but his small fists are clenched tight. This is Prince Harry in 1997, following Princess Diana's casket through London streets. But where was his father in this moment of grief? Prince Charles didn't comfort his young son. Instead, following royal tradition, Harry was told to walk straight, be strong, and not show his feelings. For centuries, the British royal family has treated their children not as kids who need love and hugs, but as future kings and queens who need to be tough. This is the real story of how Britain's royal family has been raising their children for generations, and why it left a trail of hurt that continues today. Queen Victoria ruled England during a time when the British Empire was the most powerful in the world. From her huge palaces, she commanded armies and made decisions that affected millions of people. But inside those palace walls, she had a dark secret. She was a really bad mom, especially to her oldest son Edward, also nicknamed Bertie. Even though Victoria had 9 children, she hated being a mother. In her private letters and diary, she called babies ugly, frog-like. And she complained about how noisy and annoying children were. She thought having babies just got in the way of her real job, being queen. Her oldest son Bertie got the worst of her mean behavior. Victoria never tried to hide how disappointed she was in him. When he was young and struggled with his schoolwork, she would tell everyone, even important people who visited the palace, that Bertie was slow and lazy. She wrote mean things about him in letters that people can still read today. School was especially hard for Bertie. Doctors think he probably had dyslexia, which makes reading difficult. But instead of helping him, Victoria made things worse. She hired strict teachers who made him study for hours and hours every day. They forced him to learn difficult subjects like Latin, Greek, and science. When he couldn't keep up, Victoria would get angry and compare him to his father, Prince Albert, who she thought was much smarter. The worst part of their relationship happened when Bertie was 19 years old. He had started seeing an actress, which made his parents very angry. His father, Prince Albert, was already sick with a dangerous fever, but he travelled through cold, rainy weather to scold Bertie at his school. A few weeks later, Albert died. Victoria went crazy with grief. She blamed Bertie for his father's death and wrote him a terrible letter, saying she couldn't even look at him without feeling sick. She refused to see him for months. Then she started wearing black clothes and never wore any other color for the rest of her life, 40 more years. Everyone knew this was her way of showing how much she blamed Bertie for Albert's death. But here's the surprising part of the story. When Victoria finally died and Bertie became King Edward VII, he turned out to be really good at being king. People loved him because he was friendly and good at making peace between countries. Everyone called him Edward the Peacemaker. Still, Victoria's mean words and actions had hurt him deeply. Even when he was a successful king, he carried the pain of knowing his mother never thought he was good enough. Victoria's way of being a cold, unloving parent started a bad tradition in the royal family. After her, many royal parents thought they needed to be strict and cold instead of loving and kind. This way of raising royal children would go on to hurt many more kids in the royal family, including Prince Charles and Prince Harry. In 1952, when Queen Elizabeth II became Queen of England, something changed in the way she treated her young son Charles. The crown on her head seemed heavier than her role as a mother. While most kids got to hug their moms whenever they wanted, 4-year-old Charles lived in a different world, one where even seeing his mother required an official appointment. The most telling story happened when Charles was 5. Elizabeth left on a 6-month royal tour, traveling around the world to visit different parts of the British Empire. When she finally came home, she didn't run to hug her little boy who had missed her for half a year. Instead, she shook his hand. This single moment captures everything about how Charles grew up, in a world where royal duties always came before a child's need for love. Life in the palace followed strict rules. Charles couldn't just run to his mother's room when he felt sad or scared. He had to follow proper royal protocol. He needed palace staff to schedule time with his own mother. He had to bow to her in public, just like everyone else. At dinner, he couldn't start eating until the Queen had taken her first bite. While Elizabeth traveled the world meeting presidents and prime ministers, Charles stayed behind with nannies. His daily life was lonely and formal. Even Christmas presents were opened according to schedule, not with the excitement of a normal child on Christmas morning. But if Elizabeth was distant, his father, Prince Philip, was harsh. Philip had grown up in a tough military school and believed boys needed to be toughened up to become real men. He looked at his sensitive, artistic son and saw everything he thought a prince shouldn't be. Charles loved art, theatre, and gardening. Philip wanted a son who loved sports, hunting, and showing no emotions. Philip believed school is expected to be a Spartan and disciplined experience in the process of developing into self-controlled, considerate, and independent adults. So he sent Charles to Gordonstoun, the same strict boarding school he had attended in Scotland. The school was famous for its brutal approach to building character. Students had to run a mile before breakfast in freezing Scottish weather, take ice-cold showers every morning, sleep with windows wide open in winter to build resistance. The school made them face harsh physical challenges regardless of their abilities. Charles was miserable at Gordonstoun. Other students bullied him for being royal. The physical challenges left him exhausted and scared. In letters home that have since become public, he wrote about his deep unhappiness. "The people in my dormitory are foul. They throw slippers all night long or hit me with pillows. It's such a hole, this place." Charles hated every moment of it, later describing it as Colditz in kilts, comparing it to a Nazi prisoner of war camp. But when Charles begged to change schools, Philip refused. He saw his son's tears as weakness that needed to be stamped out. Even when Charles was clearly suffering, Philip's response was always the same: "Don't be weak." This rejection of Charles's sensitive nature had lasting effects. Charles grew up feeling like he could never make his father proud. Meanwhile, his sister Anne became Philip's favorite because she was naturally tough and sporty, which was everything Philip wanted in a child. Philip even called Anne the son I never had, not caring how this hurt Charles. The damage from this cold parenting style spread through the whole family. Out of Elizabeth and Philip's 4 children, 3 ended up divorced. What a shock for the royal family. None of them learned how to show love easily to their own children. The cycle of distant parenting continued into the next generation. Even at the end of his life, Philip never really connected with Charles. Their relationship remained formal and strained, filled with all the hurt of those childhood years. The pattern was set. Royal duty would always come before family love, and showing feelings was a sign of weakness, not strength. And so the cycle continued. After years of growing up with cold parents who never hugged him, Charles became a father himself. But instead of giving his sons William and Harry the warmth he never had, he followed the same rigid royal rules that had hurt him so deeply. The problem started even before his sons were born. The royal family pressured Charles to find a suitable wife to give them heirs to the throne. At that time, he had already found the love of his life, Camilla Parker Bowles. But there was a problem. She wasn't seen as a suitable royal wife. The royal family didn't approve of Camilla. They believed she lacked the aristocratic innocence expected of a future queen. So instead, Charles was pushed into an arranged marriage with Lady Diana Spencer, a young woman from a noble family. She was only 20 years old when they married in what looked like a fairy tale wedding. But there was a huge problem at the heart of this marriage. Charles was still in love with Camilla. Diana quickly discovered she had stepped into a lonely world. The palace halls were grand but cold, just like her husband. In a famous interview years later, she spoke history's words. "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," meaning Charles was still seeing Camilla. Diana felt trapped and alone. Soon, Diana started struggling with serious problems. She developed an eating disorder called bulimia. She felt overwhelmed by constant attention from photographers who followed her everywhere. She needed help and support, but Charles had no idea how to comfort her. Remember, he grew up in a family where showing feelings was seen as weak. So when Diana cried or needed emotional support, Charles told her to stay quiet and handle it privately, exactly what his parents would have done. When William and Harry were born, Charles tried to be a father the only way he knew how, the royal way. He stuck to the same formal rules he had grown up with. The boys had to call him Sir instead of Dad in public. They couldn't show too much emotion. They had to follow strict palace schedules. Even playtime was carefully planned and supervised. The worst example of Charles's cold parenting came after Diana died in a car crash in 1997. Harry was just 12 years old, a child who had lost his mother in a terrible accident. But instead of letting Harry grieve privately, Charles made him walk behind Diana's coffin in the funeral procession while millions of people watched. Harry later said this was one of the hardest things he ever had to do. No child should have to hide their grief, but royal tradition demanded it. The saddest part of this story is how the cycle of cold parenting kept repeating. Charles couldn't give his sons the love they needed because he never learned how to show love himself. The crown's weight was heavier than a father's heart. As the boys grew older, they dealt with their father's emotional distance in different ways. William accepted it, knowing he would be king someday and had to follow royal rules. But Harry struggled more and more. He missed his mother's warmth and found the royal rules suffocating. The breaking point came when Harry married Meghan Markle, when newspapers attacked Meghan with cruel stories, just like they had done to Diana. Harry begged his father for help. But Charles, following the same pattern he learned from his parents, told them to stay quiet and endure it. He couldn't break free from the royal way of handling problems, pretend everything is fine, and never complain. The full weight of royal parenting finally came crashing down when Harry and Meghan welcomed their first child, Archie. What should have been a joyous celebration quickly turned dark, showing just how deep the royal family's problems ran. Most royal babies arrive for grand ceremonies, fancy titles, and round-the-clock security teams. But little Archie's welcome was different. The palace did not give him a royal title or even basic security protection. Even worse, someone in the royal family raised concerns about how dark Archie's skin might be since Meghan's mother is black. For Harry, these actions brought back painful memories. He had watched his mother, Diana, suffer under the weight of royal judgment. He had felt the sting of the palace's cold rules as a child. Now history was repeating itself with his wife and son. On a cold January morning in 2020, Harry and Meghan did something no one expected. They announced they were leaving the royal family. What's truly remarkable is that they are breaking free from centuries of tradition, a system that has harmed royal children for generations. Harry chose the one thing royal parents before him never had. He chose love over duty. In a 5-part documentary series, Harry said, "My father used to say to both William and I, well, it was like that for me, so it's going to be like that for you. But that doesn't make sense. Just because you suffered doesn't mean your kids have to suffer." During an interview with Oprah Winfrey, Harry expanded further. "I was trapped, but I didn't know I was trapped. Trapped within the system, like the rest of the family. My father and my brother are trapped. They don't get to leave, and I have huge compassion for that." After centuries of royal parents choosing the crown over their children's happiness, one prince finally said, "Enough." With King Charles III now leading the royal family, the world watches to see if he will finally modernize royal parenting, or if his own childhood has left scars too deep to overcome. Prince William, now a father himself, has publicly promised to raise his children differently, but the shadow of tradition still looms large. After all, Prince George, just 11 years old, is already being prepared for his role as king. His childhood, much like Charles's before him, will be shaped by the pressures of the crown, the expectations of the public, and the weight of a centuries-old institution. So, will history repeat itself? The British monarchy has long been known for its pageantry, power, and prestige. But behind the palaces and tiaras, the truth remains. No matter how much wealth they hold, the royal family has always been bankrupt when it comes to love. As royal children still bow before their queen grandmother and call their father Sir, somewhere in California, a former prince runs freely with his children, far from the palace rules and cold traditions, with no protocol to obey. Perhaps this, in the end, is the most powerful kind of royalty, the courage to choose love.